Hey guys, tonight we begin with a torture device that never existed, but accomplished more through its imagined horror than any real punishment tool ever could. The Iron Maiden, that iconic spiked sarcophagus supposedly used to impale victims slowly through closure, is almost certainly a 19th century fabrication with no credible evidence of medieval use. Yet, this fake torture device became more culturally powerful than actual historical punishments, appearing in museums, inspiring horror, and shaping popular understanding of medieval justice for over a century before historians conclusively demonstrated it was theatrical prop marketed as genuine artifact. The Iron Maiden's power came not from its reality, but from its plausibility, from people's willingness to believe that medieval authorities would create such elaborate cruelty. Here's why this manufactured myth matters beyond correcting historical record. The Iron Maiden represents a broader pattern where societies control behavior through fear of punishments that don't actually exist or are never actually used. The threat does the work. The spectacle creates compliance. Whether medieval lords maintained order partly through subjects believing in tortures that were more fiction than fact, or modern institutions shape behavior through consequences that are more imagined than enforced, the mechanism is identical. Understanding how the Iron Maiden myth functioned reveals how quiet laws work, how societies manufacture compliance through theatrical display rather than consistent enforcement, and how the space between perceived consequences and actual consequences becomes a governance tool more powerful than either truth or lies alone. The transformation from non-existent device to cultural icon demonstrates how myths become accepted facts when they confirm what people already believe about the past. The Iron Maiden worked as historical narrative because 19th century audiences wanted to believe medieval people were barbarically creative in their cruelty, because the device seemed plausibly medieval, even though it was thoroughly modern, and because once museums displayed Iron Maidens as authentic artifacts, challenging their authenticity meant challenging institutional authority. The fake torture device became real through social consensus that it should be real, through collective investment in a past that justified present self-congratulation about progress and civilization. Tonight, we're examining how the Iron Maiden myth was created and propagated, why people believed it despite lack of evidence, what actual medieval punishment practices it obscured, and most importantly, what this fabricated device reveals about how societies use the threat of extreme consequences to maintain order without actually implementing those consequences. We'll see how quiet laws function through spectacular display of potential punishment rather than consistent application. How the gap between what people think will happen and what actually happens creates space for governance through managed fear, and how understanding this dynamic transforms how we see both historical and contemporary social control. If examining how manufactured myths shape behavior appeals to you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Candle History, but only if you appreciate historical analysis that questions comfortable narratives about the past. Leave a comment sharing what historical fact you later discovered was actually myth or exaggeration. The realization that much of what we think we know is constructed rather than discovered never gets old. Now let's explore how a torture device that never tortured anyone became one of history's most effective tools of social control. The evidence against the Iron Maiden's medieval authenticity is overwhelming once you look for it, which is precisely why the myth persisted for so long. Nobody looked. The device first appears in documented history in the early 19th century, when Johann Philipp Siebenkees, a German philosopher and archaeologist, described one supposedly used in Nuremberg in 1515. His account was detailed, dramatic, and completely unsupported by any contemporary sources from 1515 or the surrounding decades. No trial records, no execution documentation, no witness accounts, no administrative records showing purchase or maintenance of such a device. The Iron Maiden appeared fully formed in Siebenkees' narrative without any documentary trail that should exist if cities were actually using elaborate execution devices. The physical evidence is equally damning. The Iron Maidens that exist in museums and collections date to the 19th century, based on construction techniques, materials, and design elements. They're built with industrial-era metalworking methods, use metal alloys that weren't available in medieval periods, and incorporate mechanical features reflecting 19th century engineering rather than medieval craftsmanship. When historians and metallurgists examine supposed medieval Iron Maidens using modern dating techniques, they consistently dated to the 1800s. The devices are real objects, but they're real 19th century objects falsely presented as medieval artifacts. They're props, not punishments. The historical silence is perhaps most telling. Medieval and early modern Europe produced extensive documentation about executions, torture, and punishment. Court records detailed methods used, costs incurred, and procedures followed. Cities kept careful accounts of execution equipment, its purchase, maintenance, and use. Chroniclers described spectacular public punishments in gruesome detail because they were newsworthy events. If Iron Maidens were actually used for executions, we would expect to find them mentioned in this extensive documentary record. We don't. The device appears nowhere in the enormous archive of medieval justice documentation. This absence is evidence. Silence this complete and consistent indicates non-existence, not oversight. The iconographic gap reinforces the case. Medieval and Renaissance artists depicted torture and execution extensively in paintings, woodcuts, manuscripts, and sculptures. They showed breaking wheels, racks, gallows, stakes, and countless other punishment tools with detailed accuracy, because these images served both documentary and didactic purposes. Yet, Iron Maidens appear nowhere in this visual record until the 19th century, when they suddenly become popular subjects for romantic medievalist art. The absence from medieval iconography that depicted everything else about punishment suggests strongly that Iron Maidens didn't exist to be depicted. Artists can't draw what they've never seen or heard of. The scholarly consensus that emerged by the late 20th century holds that Iron Maidens are 19th century inventions, created either as curiosities for emergent museums or as deliberate forgeries capitalizing on romantic fascination with medieval barbarism. Some may have been constructed as carnival attractions or theatrical props that were later misrepresented as historical artifacts. Others might have been created as Gothic horror art that acquired false provenance through mistaken attribution or intentional fraud. Regardless of specific origins, modern historians universally reject the Iron Maiden as medieval punishment device, while acknowledging it as real phenomenon of 19th century medievalist culture. The device existed, it just wasn't what it claimed to be. The Iron Maiden myth succeeded because it confirmed 19th century preconceptions about medieval brutality in ways that more complex historical realities couldn't match. The 19th century needed to believe the medieval period was barbaric, superstitious, and cruel to justify its own self-image as enlightened, rational, and progressive. A torture device that combined mechanical ingenuity with sadistic purpose perfectly embodied what moderns wanted to believe about medieval people. The Iron Maiden was too good a story to fact-check, too perfect an encapsulation of medieval otherness to question, too useful for cultural purposes to abandon just because it wasn't true. The museum authentication provided legitimacy that individual skepticism couldn't easily challenge. When respectable institutions like the Criminal Museum in Rothenburg or the Tower of London displayed Iron Maidens as genuine medieval artifacts, they conferred institutional authority on the forgeries. Museum visitors naturally assumed that curators had verified authenticity, that scholarship supported the attributions, that the devices wouldn't be displayed if their medieval origins were questionable. This assumption was wrong, but reasonable. Museums were supposed to gatekeep truth. When they failed this function through ignorance, fraud, or willing suspension of critical inquiry, they became propagators of myth disguised as knowledge. The institutional imprimatur transformed plausible fiction into accepted fact. The visual impact of the devices reinforced belief through emotional conviction that overrode intellectual skepticism. An Iron Maiden is a terrifying object. Standing before one, seeing the spike arrangement, imagining the closure mechanism, the experience triggers visceral horror that feels like proof of authenticity. The emotional response creates certainty that doesn't require documentary evidence or logical analysis. People believed because they could imagine the device working, because the horror felt real even if the history wasn't, because the affective experience of confronting the object generated conviction stronger than scholarly arguments about its absence from medieval records. The myth succeeded partly through bypassing rational evaluation and operating at the level of gut response. The narrative economy of the Iron Maiden myth also contributed to its persistence. Explaining that medieval punishment was complex, varied by jurisdiction and era, often more concerned with public shame than physical pain, and generally less spectacular than imagined, requires nuance and historical knowledge. Explaining that authorities sometimes didn't punish criminals at all because enforcement was expensive and difficult, or that punishments were often commuted or negotiated, complicates clean narratives about medieval justice. The Iron Maiden offers a simpler story. Medieval people were barbarically creative torturers. This simplicity is narratively attractive. It packages medieval justice in memorable, dramatic form that requires no contextual knowledge or analytical complexity. Easy stories displace accurate ones when accuracy is complicated. The confirmation bias operated powerfully because the Iron Maiden fit existing narratives about medieval darkness that people already believed from other sources. If you've been taught that medieval people were superstitious, violent, and backwards, and you're shown a torture device that demonstrates exactly those qualities, you don't question it. You recognize it. It confirms what you already know. The psychological predisposition to accept information that matches pre-existing beliefs meant that the Iron Maiden encountered little critical resistance because it told people what they expected to hear about the medieval period. The myth succeeded by being the story people wanted the past to tell, regardless of whether it was the story the past actually told. Medieval punishment was generally less concerned with inflicting physical pain than with performing justice publicly, extracting financial penalties, and reintegrating offenders into communities after demonstrating their subordination to law. The punishments that did involve physical suffering were usually quick rather than prolonged, practical rather than theatrical, and focused on visible marking or public humiliation more than on elaborate torture. The break-in wheel, a genuinely medieval punishment device, killed relatively quickly through bone breaking and wasn't the prolonged torture that later depictions suggested. The gallows were standard execution technology that worked through hanging, not through drawn-out suffering. Even beheading, another common execution method, was meant to be swift and definitive. The torture that did occur in medieval and early modern justice was primarily investigative rather than punitive, designed to extract confessions rather than to punish crimes. Judicial torture followed strict legal protocols, limiting what could be done, for how long, and under what evidentiary conditions. The rack stretched joints to cause pain that would compel confession. Strapado suspended prisoners by wrists bound behind their backs to create shoulder pain that became unbearable. These were awful, but they were procedural tools within inquisitorial legal systems, not creative sadism. They had specific purposes within judicial frameworks, and their use was constrained by rules about when torture was permissible and what torture was allowed. The constraints weren't always followed, but they existed as legal framework. The financial punishments dominated medieval justice in ways that physical punishments didn't, because medieval authorities primarily wanted revenue and restitution, not mutilated criminals who couldn't work or pay. Fines for various offenses generated income for lords and cities. Confiscation of property from serious criminals provided windfalls to authorities. Requiring offenders to make restitution to victims served justice without destroying the offender's economic capacity. Imprisonment was rare and expensive, except for high-status political prisoners, because keeping people locked up cost money without generating revenue. The economic rationality of medieval justice militates against the Iron Maiden model. Why build expensive, elaborate torture devices when you can fine people, confiscate their stuff, and let them go back to work? The public nature of medieval punishment focused on shame and spectacle rather than hidden suffering. Placing criminals in stocks or pillories displayed them publicly for mockery and abuse, but didn't permanently damage them. Brandon marked offenders visibly to warn others about their criminal status, but left them capable of working and contributing economically. Public whipping demonstrated authority's power while serving as deterrent, but again, it didn't destroy the offender's future economic usefulness. The public performances of punishment were designed to communicate messages about order, hierarchy, and justice to watching communities. They were pedagogical theater meant to reinforce norms and demonstrate consequences. The Iron Maiden, being an enclosed device that hid the victim, would defeat the publicity purpose that medieval punishment prioritized. The communal participation in punishment through witnessing, jeering, or sometimes throwing things at offenders in pillories created social bonding that isolated torture in closed devices couldn't replicate. Medieval punishment often reinforced community identity through collective participation in justice performances. The crowd at an execution or public whipping wasn't just observing. They were participating in a ritual that reaffirmed social boundaries and collective values. The Iron Maiden, being individual torture in an isolated device, would eliminate this communal dimension that was crucial to medieval punishment's social functions. It's the wrong technology for what medieval justice was actually trying to accomplish, which is one reason it's implausible as medieval device regardless of direct evidence. Quiet laws function through creating perception of enforcement that exceeds actual enforcement, through making consequences seem more certain and severe than they really are, and through leveraging fear of punishment to prevent behavior without actually having to punish that behavior frequently. The Iron Maiden myth represents quiet law at work because the device's cultural presence created deterrent effect through threat rather than through use. Whether any Iron Maidens ever existed, the belief that they existed and might be used created behavioral influence. The myth accomplished what the reality couldn't: widespread behavioral modification through threat alone, without the costs and complications of actual enforcement. Modern societies use quiet laws extensively, even if they don't admit it. Speed limits are nominally enforced laws, but actual enforcement is selective and probabilistic. Most speeding violations go unpunished, but drivers modify behavior based on perceived probability of being caught rather than actual probability. The traffic camera creates outsized deterrent effect relative to its coverage because drivers know cameras exist and might be anywhere, even though cameras actually cover small fractions of roadways. The quiet law operates through uncertainty about where enforcement is versus where it might be, creating behavioral modification through risk perception rather than through consistent punishment. The mechanism works because people usually don't test the limits systematically to discover where enforcement actually is. The tax system represents massive, quiet law infrastructure, where accurate reporting depends on taxpayers believing audits are likely enough to deter cheating, even though actual audit rates are tiny fractions of returns filed. The IRS doesn't have resources to verify most tax returns, but taxpayers generally comply because they believe they might get caught if they don't. The quiet law operates through opacity about selection criteria and through publicizing the occasional prosecutions that do occur to maintain fear despite low actual enforcement rates. The system depends on people overestimating enforcement probability and consequences, creating compliance through perceived risk that exceeds actual risk. If everyone knew the real audit probability and called the bluff, the system would collapse. The professional licensing requirements that govern countless occupations create quiet law frameworks where operating without license is technically illegal, but enforcement is sporadic and complaint-driven. Most unlicensed activity goes unpunished unless someone reports it or unless the unlicensed practitioner causes harm that triggers investigation. The quiet law maintains order through most people believing enforcement is likely enough to deter them from operating illegally, even though most illegal operation would actually go undetected and unpunished. The system depends on people choosing not to test the enforcement rather than on consistent enforcement, catching and punishing violators. The threat does more work than the reality. The quiet law's efficiency comes from avoiding enforcement costs while achieving most of compliance that actual enforcement would create. Punishing every violation would require vast resources, constant surveillance, and administrative capacity that exceeds what any realistic government could maintain. The quiet law achieves similar compliance through strategic publicity of occasional enforcement, through creating uncertainty about where enforcement might occur, and through establishing that punishment is possible even if it's not probable. The cost savings are enormous. Instead of enforcing everywhere constantly, authorities enforce selectively and publicize strategically, creating compliance through probability perception rather than through certain consequences. The Iron Maiden myth represents this logic at extreme. All deterrence, no enforcement, pure threat, divorced entirely from application. Medieval and early modern authorities understood that theatrical display of punishment could accomplish more than the punishments themselves, that creating memorable spectacles of justice would influence behavior beyond what routine application of penalties could achieve. Public executions were performances designed to maximize attendance, emotional impact, and subsequent discussion. The scaffold was stage. The condemned person was character. The execution was climactic finale. The audience left with vivid memories that would influence their own behavior and that they would share with others who hadn't attended. One theatrical execution influenced thousands through both direct witness and subsequent narrative transmission, creating deterrent multiplier effects that mundane punishments couldn't match. The Iron Maiden, whether real or imagined, fits perfectly into theatrical display strategy because it's more memorable than practical punishment tools. A break-in wheel or gallows are functional, but not particularly unique or imaginative. An Iron Maiden is spectacular, novel, frightening in ways that standard execution methods weren't. If the goal is creating memorable deterrent narratives that circulate through populations and modify behavior, an Iron Maiden is superior to straightforward tools regardless of whether you actually use it. The theoretical value comes from the imagined experience of being enclosed in spiked darkness and crushed to death slowly. That image does psychological work that more mundane execution methods can't accomplish. The spectacle creates impact disproportionate to any actual use. Modern museum displays perpetuate theatrical strategy by presenting punishment implements in ways designed to trigger horror and fascination. The Iron Maidens in museums aren't displayed as fabrications or curiosities. They're presented as authentic historical artifacts, often with dramatic lighting, isolated placement, and descriptive text emphasizing their terrible purpose. This staging creates emotional experiences for visitors that serve educational and entertainment purposes while also reinforcing beliefs about medieval barbarism that justify present comfort with modernity. The museums become theaters, presenting historical narratives through curated objects, with the Iron Maiden playing starring role in a story about humanity's progress from barbarism to civilization. The theatrical value exceeds the historical value. The horror entertainment industry has exploited Iron Maiden imagery extensively in films, games, books, and attractions that use the device as shorthand for medieval torture. These cultural productions reinforce the myth by circulating images and narratives that embed the Iron Maiden deeper into collective imagination, regardless of historical accuracy. Each horror movie torture scene featuring an Iron Maiden, each video game using one as execution animation, each haunted house incorporating one as prop creates new generations who know the Iron Maiden as cultural icon, even if they don't know it's historically fraudulent. The theatrical currency compounds through repeated cultural circulation, making the myth more real through repetition than fact-checking could make it false. The paradox is that calling out the Iron Maiden as fraud often increases rather than decreases its cultural power, because the revelation becomes part of the story's appeal. People enjoy knowing they were deceived, sharing the debunking information as interesting trivia, and feeling sophisticated for recognizing what they once believed was false. The Iron Maiden survives its own exposure as myth by becoming a myth about myths, a cautionary tale about historical gullibility that nonetheless keeps the device culturally present and psychologically potent. The theatrical strategy succeeds even when the deception is revealed, because the reveal becomes new performance, new narrative worth circulating and experiencing. The myth becomes immortal through dying repeatedly. The economic logic of imaginary enforcement is brutally efficient. Creating actual enforcement infrastructure requires training personnel, building facilities, developing processes, maintaining systems, and bearing ongoing operational costs. Creating the belief that enforcement exists requires only theatrical investment in visible markers of potential enforcement, without the full operational infrastructure those markers nominally represent. The cost difference is orders of magnitude. A society that can convince most people most of the time that enforcement will catch and punish violations has achieved cheap governance. A society that actually has to catch and punish most violations most of the time has committed to expensive governance. The imaginary enforcement reduces costs while maintaining order. The deterrence calculation changes when people believe consequences are more certain than they are. If I believe there's a 20% chance I'll be caught speeding when the actual probability is 2%, my behavior modifies based on the believed probability rather than the actual probability. This perception gap creates behavior change without corresponding enforcement increase, allowing authorities to govern more people with fewer resources. The whole apparatus works through maintaining the perception gap, through preventing people from discovering how much enforcement is imaginary versus real. The Iron Maiden represents this logic perfectly, a deterrent that might not exist, but whose imagined existence influences behavior. The cost of the imagination is minimal. The cost of the reality would have been substantial. The occasional spectacular enforcement event maintains the imaginary system's credibility by providing evidence that enforcement is real even when it's rare. Publicizing the few cases where violators are actually caught and punished creates narratives that circulate widely and convince others that enforcement is active and effective, despite the statistical reality that most violations go unpunished. The strategic publicity transforms small enforcement into large perceived enforcement through narrative multiplication. Everyone hears about the one person who got audited or the one speeder who got a huge fine. And those narratives shape behavior for thousands who won't be audited or fined, but who believe they might be because they heard about someone who was. The system's efficiency depends on people not coordinating to discover actual enforcement rates. If violators shared information systematically about who actually got punished and who didn't, they would quickly realize that enforcement is far sparser than imagined. But social atomization, punishment stigma, and information costs prevent this coordination. People who violate laws don't advertise it. People who get caught are embarrassed. People who don't get caught don't know whether others are also not getting caught or whether they're lucky outliers. This information opacity allows the imaginary enforcement to persist because individuals can't efficiently discover the collective reality that would reveal the system's sparseness. The myth survives through preventing empirical falsification. The ethical complexity is that imaginary enforcement can be both more humane and more insidious than real enforcement. It's more humane because fewer people actually suffer punishment, because the threat does the work without the pain. It's more insidious because it operates through deception, through creating fear that may be disproportionate to actual danger, and through manipulating perception in ways that some would consider unethical governance. The Iron Maiden embodies this complexity perfectly. If it never existed, but people believed it did, and that belief prevented crime, is that good governance through efficient deterrence, or bad governance through manipulation and fraud? The question doesn't have obvious answer, which is why quiet laws raise philosophical problems that straightforward enforcement doesn't. The Iron Maiden became real through social consensus that it was real, demonstrating how collective belief can transform fiction into functional reality regardless of underlying truth. When museums displayed Iron Maidens as authentic medieval devices, when historians accepted them uncritically, when popular culture incorporated them as historical facts, the devices achieved social reality that had practical effects even though they lacked historical reality. People made decisions, felt emotions, and modified behaviors based on believing Iron Maidens were medieval torture devices. Those decisions, emotions, and behaviors were real, even though the historical claim enabling them was false. The consensus reality functioned regardless of truth. Modern societies contain countless consensus realities where widespread belief in things that aren't literally true creates functional systems that work as if they were true. Money is consensus reality. The dollar bills in your wallet have value because everyone agrees they have value, not because the paper and ink possess intrinsic worth. If consensus collapsed and people stopped believing currency had value, it would lose value, regardless of government guarantees or legal tender laws. The system works through collective belief, not through physical properties of the objects. The consensus creates reality that physical analysis would deny, yet the consensus reality governs actual behavior and enables actual transactions that have actual consequences. Institutional authority operates as consensus reality, where courts, universities, and governments have power because people collectively agree to treat them as authoritative, not because they possess inherent authority independent of social recognition. A judge's ruling matters because we agree that judges have authority to issue binding rulings, because we've collectively decided to organize society around institutions with defined powers. The authority is circular, depending on belief in authority to create authority. If consensus broke and people stopped recognizing judicial authority, courts would lose power regardless of laws or constitutions. The Iron Maiden demonstrates how consensus reality can persist even when it contradicts material evidence, because social agreement can override empirical verification when belief serves psychological or institutional purposes. The resistance to correcting consensus realities comes from the social, psychological, and institutional investments people make based on believing the consensus. If you've built careers studying medieval torture and you've written books about Iron Maidens, accepting that they're fraudulent threatens your professional credibility and requires painful revision of work. If you're a museum that's displayed Iron Maidens as authentic artifacts for decades, admitting they're forgeries means admitting you deceived visitors and requires expensive deacquisition and reinterpretation. The sunk costs create resistance to correction because correction imposes costs that maintaining the false consensus avoids. People will defend consensus realities vigorously, even when presented with contradicting evidence, because changing consensus is expensive. The gradual erosion of the Iron Maiden consensus reality demonstrates how even powerful false beliefs eventually collapse when evidence becomes overwhelming and when institutional incentives shift toward accuracy. As historical methodology improved, as skepticism about medieval artifacts increased, as scholars accumulated negative evidence through systematic examination of punishment records and physical analysis of supposed medieval devices, the consensus became harder to maintain. Eventually, maintaining the false consensus cost more in credibility and scholarly reputation than admitting error. The shift happened slowly, with resistant pockets persisting long after scholarly consensus changed. But it happened because truth eventually generates enough pressure that consensus realities crack. The Iron Maiden myth died, but it took over a century, and it's not entirely dead even now. Manufactured traditions are practices, objects, or narratives presented as ancient or traditional, but actually invented recently to serve contemporary purposes, while claiming historical continuity and authority. The Iron Maiden is manufactured tradition presented as medieval punishment device when it's actually 19th century theatrical prop. The manufacturing process involves creating an object or story, attributing it to the distant past, providing plausible but unverifiable provenance, and allowing the false attribution to circulate until it becomes accepted fact through repetition and institutional validation. Once manufactured tradition becomes established, challenging it means fighting against accumulated investment, emotional attachment, and social consensus. National traditions contain numerous manufactured elements, where practices presented as ancient customs were actually invented in recent centuries to create national identity or political legitimacy. The Scottish tartan clan system that seems timeless was largely invented in the 18th and 19th centuries. The elaborate coronation ceremonies that seem to preserve ancient monarchy were substantially redesigned in Victorian era. The traditional German Christmas practices that feel historically rooted were codified in the 19th century. These manufactured traditions serve real social functions by creating continuity, identity, and meaning. But they accomplish this through fabricating connections to pasts that didn't exist in forms claimed. The Iron Maiden fits this pattern of using invented tradition to serve contemporary needs. The manufacturing process requires multiple actors playing complementary roles, usually without coordinating consciously. Someone creates the original fabrication, whether deliberately or through mistake. Early adopters promote it, finding value in the fiction. Authorities validate it by including it in official narratives or displaying it in institutional contexts. Popular culture spreads it through repetition that makes familiarity feel like proof. Eventually, the manufactured tradition becomes so embedded that it's easier to maintain than to correct, and people who benefit from it actively resist challenges to its authenticity. The Iron Maiden had forgers creating devices, museum curators displaying them, historians writing about them, and popular culture circulating them until the manufactured tradition became historical fact through social process rather than through historical truth. The functions served by manufactured traditions often matter more than their historical accuracy, because the traditions operate in the present to shape current behavior, identity, and relationships. If believing that your nation has ancient customs creates social cohesion and political stability, the belief serves function regardless of whether the customs are actually ancient. If displaying torture devices as medieval artifacts helps museum visitors understand punishment history and appreciate modernity, the display serves educational purpose, even if the specific devices are fraudulent. The functional value creates resistance to accuracy, because accuracy sometimes destroys the function. The Iron Maiden taught people about medieval justice even though it was false, and for many purposes the teaching mattered more than the truth. The ethical problem is that manufactured traditions involve deception that infantilizes populations by treating them as unable to handle historical complexity or ambiguity. When authorities present invented traditions as authentic history, they deny people access to accurate information and replace complex reality with simplified fiction. This paternalism assumes populations need comforting narratives more than challenging truths, need identity myths more than historical accuracy, need to be manipulated for their own good rather than trusted with complex information. The Iron Maiden myth exemplifies this when museums continued displaying fraudulent devices as authentic after knowing they were fraudulent because curators decided visitors preferred the dramatic fiction to the boring truth. The decision to maintain the lie reveals contempt for public intelligence disguised as curatorial expertise. The 19th century's Gothic medievalism created massive market for medieval artifacts, relics, and objects that incentivized forgery, exaggeration, and misattribution on industrial scale. Wealthy collectors wanted medieval torture devices, religious relics, knightly armor, and architectural elements from churches and castles. This demand created supply through legitimate trade in actual medieval objects, but also through fabrication of fake medieval objects that satisfied market demand when genuine articles were scarce or expensive. The Iron Maiden emerged from this context, where manufacturing fake medieval devices was profitable enterprise, serving customers who valued medieval authenticity, or at least the appearance of it. The museum explosion of the 19th century created institutional buyers who needed exhibits to attract visitors and who sometimes privileged spectacle over authenticity when acquiring collections. A museum displaying an Iron Maiden would attract more visitors than a museum displaying the actual medieval punishment tools, which were mostly mundane items like ropes, whips, and branding irons. The theatrical appeal of the Iron Maiden justified acquisition even if provenance was questionable or if curators suspected fabrication. The museum's economic model depended on ticket sales driven by spectacular exhibits, and an Iron Maiden was spectacularly effective at drawing crowds regardless of its historical legitimacy. The commercial incentives trumped scholarly standards. The antiquities market developed elaborate forgery networks where craftsmen specialized in creating medieval-style objects using period-appropriate materials and techniques to fool buyers and experts. Some forges were commissioned by dealers who knew they were selling fakes, but who represented them as genuine to customers. Others worked for clients who wanted medieval objects for decoration or display without caring about authenticity. The Iron Maiden construction required skilled metalworking to create convincing medieval appearance while incorporating mechanical features that made the device actually function as described. The forgery was sophisticated craft that required knowledge of both medieval aesthetics and mechanical engineering, producing objects that were technically impressive, even if historically fraudulent. The authentication challenges meant that even experts couldn't easily distinguish genuine medieval objects from skilled 19th century fabrications without modern scientific dating techniques. Metalwork that appeared corroded and ancient might be artificially aged. Stylistic elements that seemed medieval might be copied from genuine examples. Provenance documents could be fabricated as easily as the objects themselves. The epistemological uncertainty created space for frauds to circulate and for dubious attributions to gain acceptance through sheer persistence. Museums and collectors who wanted to believe objects were authentic found justifications for accepting questionable provenance rather than applying skepticism that would reveal uncomfortable truths about their acquisitions. The complicity between forgers, dealers, museums, and collectors created ecosystem where everyone benefited from maintaining fictions even when they suspected truth. Forgers made money creating fake medieval objects. Dealers made money selling them. Museums attracted visitors by displaying them. Collectors gained prestige from owning them. Challenging the authenticity of major acquisitions threatened all these interests, creating incentives to avoid critical examination and to defend dubious objects as genuine. The Iron Maiden circulated within this ecosystem, where multiple parties had reasons to maintain the fraud, and where truth-telling threatened economic and reputational interests. The conspiracy wasn't coordinated. It emerged from aligned incentives that made deception profitable for everyone involved. The Iron Maiden's endurance as cultural icon partly comes from its perfect embodiment of horror aesthetics that combine claustrophobia, penetration, slow death, and mechanical inevitability into single terrifying package. The image of being enclosed in darkness, feeling spikes against your body, knowing the door will close and the spikes will penetrate, experiencing helpless awareness of approaching death, creates visceral horror that engages multiple primal fears simultaneously. The device is nightmare made tangible, anxiety about being trapped and pierced, given physical form. This horror potency makes the Iron Maiden more culturally valuable than actual medieval punishment devices that killed efficiently but not dramatically. The Gothic sensibility that emerged in 18th and 19th centuries specifically valued this kind of elaborate architectural horror that combined beauty and terror. Gothic novels featured dungeons, torture, mysteries, and slow deaths in decaying medieval settings that appealed to readers who found pleasure in controlled fear and vicarious suffering. The Iron Maiden fit Gothic aesthetics perfectly as embodiment of medieval cruelty housed in beautiful metal craftsmanship. It was simultaneously artwork and instrument of death, merging aesthetic appreciation with morbid fascination in ways that Gothic culture celebrated. The device's appeal wasn't despite its horror, but because of it. Because it offered spectators a chance to experience pleasurable fear through contemplating others' imagined suffering. Modern horror has inherited this aesthetic and uses Iron Maidens extensively as visual shorthand for torture, medieval settings, and extreme suffering. Films show characters threatened with Iron Maidens to establish villains' cruelty or medieval settings' brutality. Video games use Iron Maidens as punishment mechanics or environmental hazards that players must avoid. Horror attractions include Iron Maiden props to frighten visitors. Each cultural use reinforces the device's iconic status and embeds it deeper in collective imagination regardless of historical accuracy. The aesthetic value perpetuates the myth because the image is too powerful to abandon just because it's false. Horror doesn't require truth. It requires effective fear triggers, and the Iron Maiden delivers. The psychological appeal involves safe exploration of mortality and suffering that actual medieval punishment practices don't offer in same way. Contemplating execution by beheading or hanging is disturbing but straightforward. Contemplating death by Iron Maiden involves imagining the experience in detail. The enclosure, the spike pressure, the slow increase of pain as the door closes incrementally. This imaginative engagement allows people to explore fear and mortality in controlled, safe context where they can experience the horror conceptually without actual danger. The detailed imaginability of Iron Maiden death creates richer psychological experience than simpler execution methods, making it more valuable for cultural purposes, even if it's historically false. The aesthetic legacy means the Iron Maiden will probably never completely disappear from cultural consciousness, even as historical awareness of its fraudulence increases. It's too useful as horror image, too embedded in popular culture, too effective at triggering desired emotional responses. Museums may stop displaying Iron Maidens as authentic medieval devices and start presenting them as 19th century forgeries, but horror films will keep using Iron Maiden imagery because it works dramatically. The device transitions from false history to acknowledged fiction while maintaining cultural presence because its aesthetic value exceeds its historical value. The myth lives on through serving purposes that don't require historical accuracy. The Iron Maiden's exposure as fraud reflects broader evolution in historical evidence standards, where 20th century professionalization demanded higher levels of verification than 19th century scholarship required. Early historians often accepted objects and narratives at face value, if they seemed plausible and fit established interpretations. The expectation was that museums and collections contained genuine artifacts because institutions were trusted authorities. The idea that museums might display forgeries deliberately or through ignorance wasn't seriously considered. This trusting approach allowed frauds to circulate unchallenged because challenging institutional authority required evidence that institutions themselves controlled. The methodological revolution in historical and archaeological practice established principles requiring independent verification, cross-referencing multiple sources, applying scientific dating techniques, and maintaining skepticism about provenance claims. Instead of assuming objects were what they claimed to be, scholars began assuming objects might be fraudulent until proven genuine. This evidential burden shift exposed countless forgeries across museums and collections, including the Iron Maidens. The new standards required positive evidence of medieval origin rather than accept an absence of evidence against medieval origin. Under rigorous examination, Iron Maidens failed completely because no positive evidence existed supporting their medieval attribution. The scientific dating techniques that emerged in the 20th century provided objective verification that 19th century connoisseurship couldn't match. Metallurgical analysis could determine when metal was smelted and what impurities it contained, revealing whether alloys matched medieval or modern production. Radiocarbon dating could establish organic material ages. Microscopic examination could detect tool marks showing modern rather than medieval fabrication techniques. These scientific methods democratized authentication by making it less dependent on subjective expert judgment and more based on reproducible analysis. When applied to Iron Maidens, the science conclusively demonstrated 19th century origin, regardless of what curators or collectors wanted to believe. The resistance to applying new standards came from institutional conservatism and from individual scholars who had built careers on old assumptions. Museums with major Iron Maiden displays couldn't easily admit they'd been showing forgeries for decades. Historians who'd written about Iron Maidens as medieval devices faced embarrassing retractions. Collectors who'd paid significant sums for supposed medieval torture devices confronted financial losses and damaged reputations. The professional and economic stakes created opposition to new standards even when those standards were clearly superior. The generational turnover was partly what enabled change, as new scholars without investment in old errors applied rigorous methods without the defensive reactions that correction triggered in their predecessors. The contemporary situation shows standards continuing to evolve, with debates about how museums should display objects whose authenticity is questioned or whose provenance is problematic. Some argue for removing fraudulent objects entirely and focusing only on verified, authentic artifacts. Others advocate displaying questionable objects with extensive interpretation, explaining the controversies, and teaching visitors about authentication challenges. Still others suggest that fraudulent objects have historical value as forgeries, documenting the history of fabrication and collecting, even if they don't document what they claim. The Iron Maidens exemplify this debate, as museums decide whether to preserve them as examples of Gothic medievalism and 19th century forgery, or to deaccession them as worthless fakes that served no legitimate scholarly purpose. Displaying Iron Maidens as authentic medieval torture devices while knowing or suspecting they're fraudulent constitutes educational malpractice that violates museums' basic responsibility to inform rather than misinform the public. When visitors see Iron Maidens in history museums with labels identifying them as medieval execution tools, they reasonably conclude that museums have verified this attribution and that the information is reliable. If museums know the attribution is false, but display the objects anyway because they attract visitors or create dramatic exhibits, they're prioritizing spectacle over education and treating visitors as consumers to entertain rather than students to inform. This betrays the public trust that legitimizes museums as educational institutions. The financial incentives create conflicts of interest where museums' economic survival depends on ticket sales and donor contributions that spectacular exhibits generate. An Iron Maiden attracts more visitors than historically accurate displays of medieval punishment tools. More visitors means more revenue, means more institutional security. The economic logic favors displaying the Iron Maiden regardless of its authenticity, because the alternative might be budget cuts or closure. This transforms educational institutions into entertainment businesses, where historical accuracy becomes subordinate to commercial success. The mission drift is understandable given financial pressures, but it's still corruption of museums' educational purpose. The visitor expectations create additional pressure because many visitors want drama and spectacle rather than nuanced historical accuracy. Museums that remove Iron Maidens or reinterpret them as forgeries risk disappointing visitors who came specifically to see medieval torture devices and who feel cheated if told the exhibits aren't authentic. Some museums conduct visitor surveys showing that people prefer dramatic narratives even if those narratives are simplified or false, providing evidence that educational malpractice serves public preferences. This doesn't justify the malpractice, but it explains why museums might resist correction when correction means giving visitors less of what they want. The interpretive solutions attempt to balance educational responsibility with entertainment value by displaying Iron Maidens while explaining their probably forgeries and discussing why people believed they were medieval. This approach treats the Iron Maiden as object lesson about historical gullibility, authentication challenges, and Gothic medievalism, rather than as medieval torture device. It preserves the object's educational value by changing what the object teaches, Instead of teaching about medieval punishment, it teaches about 19th century fabrication and 20th century skepticism. This recontextualization salvages educational mission while maintaining visitor interest in the object, though it requires much more sophisticated interpretation than simply labeling the device as medieval tool. The accountability question is who should bear responsibility for decades of educational malpractice, and how amends should be made to millions of visitors who were misinformed. Should museums publicly apologize? Should they contact former visitors with corrections? Should they face consequences for systematic deception, even if that deception was partly ignorance rather than fraud? The practical answers are complicated because individual culpability is hard to establish. Because institutional continuity means current staff inherit predecessors' mistakes. And because enforcement mechanisms for educational malpractice barely exist. The result is usually that museums quietly reinterpret exhibits without acknowledging they misled visitors for generations, allowing errors to be corrected without accountability for having made them. The Iron Maiden myth follows patterns visible across many historical misconceptions, where 19th century inventions get attributed to earlier periods because they fit modern preconceptions about the past. The medieval chastity belt is another probable fabrication, a Victorian-era object that romanticized medieval control over women's sexuality in ways that confirmed 19th century anxieties about female fidelity. The brawl-burning feminists of the 1960s is a myth, an event that didn't happen, but that became accepted fact because it symbolized gender politics in ways people wanted to believe. These myths share structure. They're memorable. They confirm existing biases. They spread through uncritical repetition. And they resist correction because the story is better than the truth. The psychological mechanism involves narrative simplicity overriding factual complexity. Human brains evolved to remember stories rather than data, to extract patterns rather than to evaluate evidence, and to accept information that fits existing frameworks rather than to critically examine information that contradicts established beliefs. The Iron Maiden story is simple, memorable, and emotionally engaging. The debunking requires explaining absence of evidence, discussing methodology, and acknowledging uncertainty about past practices. The complexity of truth can't compete with the simplicity of fiction when brains are processing information for retention rather than accuracy. The myth wins because it's a better story than the history. The social transmission dynamics favor memorable falsehoods over accurate complexities because people share interest in stories more than boring facts. If I learned that Iron Maidens are fraudulent 19th century devices, that's interesting trivia I might share. But I'm more likely to share the dramatic original myth because it's more engaging and requires less explanation. The sharing patterns mean that false information can spread faster and farther than accurate corrections, creating information ecosystems where myths dominate despite scholarly consensus about their falsity. The Iron Maiden myth persists in popular consciousness long after scholarly consensus rejected it, because social transmission favors the myth over the correction. The institutional resistance to myth-busting comes from organizations whose identities, reputations, or economic models depend on maintaining established narratives. Tourist attractions highlighting their medieval torture museums don't want to admit their exhibits are fraudulent. Authors who've written books accepting the Iron Maiden myth resist admitting error. Media productions that used Iron Maiden imagery don't want to undermine their own content. The stakeholders in the myth create constituencies defending it against correction even after evidence becomes overwhelming. The myth develops political economy where truth threatens interests, creating opposition to accuracy from parties who benefit from fiction. The parallel in modern misinformation is exact. False news stories spread faster than corrections. Memorable conspiracy theories persist despite debunking. Simplified narratives about complex issues dominate public discourse over nuanced, accurate explanations. The mechanisms producing the Iron Maiden myth are the same mechanisms producing modern misinformation. Cognitive biases favoring memorable simplicity, social transmission favoring engaging fiction, economic incentives favoring profitable falsehoods, and institutional resistance to accuracy when accuracy threatens interests. Understanding how the Iron Maiden myth worked provides tools for understanding how modern misinformation works, because human psychology and social dynamics haven't changed, even though technologies and specific content have. The Iron Maiden myth reveals how choice architecture works by shaping behavior through manipulating perceived consequences rather than actual consequences. Choice architecture is the design of decision environments to influence choices without eliminating freedom. If you believe that medieval authorities might enclose you in Iron Maiden for crimes, you make different choices about law violation than if you believe the worst punishment is a fine. The perception shapes the choice, regardless of whether the perception matches reality. The quiet law operates through choice architecture that makes certain options seem more dangerous than they are, while making other options seem safer than they are. Modern choice architecture is everywhere, in forms like default settings that make opting out harder than accepting pre-selected choices, like physical layouts that place healthy foods at eye level in cafeterias, like social proof messages telling you most people comply with laws or norms. These interventions work through changing decision contexts rather than through coercion or elimination of options. You remain free to choose, but the architecture makes some choices easier and others harder, some options more salient and others less visible. The Iron Maiden functioned as choice architecture by making crime seem more dangerous through the threat of horrifying punishment, even if that threat wasn't real. The architectural effect on choices was real, regardless of the threat's reality. The ethical debates about choice architecture concern whether it's legitimate governance to manipulate choices through environmental design rather than through information, persuasion, or incentives. Advocates argue that choice architecture is less coercive than alternatives, that it preserves freedom while nudging people toward better choices, and that perfect rationality is impossible. So designing choice contexts to compensate for cognitive limitations is beneficial. Critics argue that choice architecture is manipulation that treats people as objects to be steered rather than as autonomous agents to be respected. That it enables authorities to control behavior without transparency or accountability, and that it infantilizes populations by making their choices for them through environmental design. The Iron Maiden as choice architecture shows both the power and the problems. It powerfully influenced behavior through threat perception, potentially preventing crimes without actual punishments, costs, and suffering. But it operated through deception, creating fear that exceeded actual danger, and manipulating choices through false information about consequences. Whether this is sophisticated governance or manipulative tyranny depends on your philosophical commitments about the relationship between truth, freedom, and authority. The device that never existed controlled behavior through architecture of imagined consequences that shaped real choices in ways neither pure coercion nor pure freedom could match. The modern applications are ubiquitous. When governments publicize tax prosecutions to create fear disproportionate to actual audit risk, that's choice architecture through imagined consequences. When schools install security cameras that don't work to make students believe they're surveilled, that's choice architecture through manufactured monitoring perception. When workplaces establish elaborate rule systems they rarely enforce, but that employees believe are enforced, that's choice architecture through perceived accountability exceeding actual accountability. The Iron Maiden logic, control through imagined consequences rather than real enforcement, is fundamental to how modern institutions govern populations with limited resources and limited tolerance for actual punishment. The Iron Maiden's trajectory from accepted fact to exposed fraud demonstrates how truth decay happens through erosion rather than through sudden revelation. The myth didn't collapse immediately when first challenged. It persisted through decades of growing skepticism, mounting contrary evidence, and shifting scholarly consensus before finally losing widespread acceptance. The decay process shows how deeply embedded false beliefs resist correction, even when evidence clearly contradicts them, and how institutional inertia preserves myths long after they should have died. Understanding this process helps explain why other historical myths persist despite debunking, and why modern misinformation survives fact-checking. The initial challenges to Iron Maiden authenticity came from historians noticing the absence of documentary evidence, and from scholars questioning the sudden 19th century appearance of devices with no earlier historical record. These early challenges were dismissed or ignored by museums and collectors invested in the object's authenticity. The resistance created a decades-long period where scholarly doubt existed alongside public acceptance, with specialists increasingly skeptical while popular audiences remained believers. The gap between expert knowledge and public knowledge persisted because institutions mediating between scholars and public chose to maintain the myth rather than communicate the growing academic consensus against it. The accumulation of scientific evidence from metallurgical analysis and dating techniques eventually made denial impossible for serious scholars, even as popular belief continued. Museums began quietly reinterpreting exhibits without publicity, changing labels from a certain medieval origin to suggesting possible 19th century manufacture to acknowledging likely fabrication. The gradual revision avoided the embarrassment of formal retraction while slowly correcting the record. This stealth correction preserved institutional credibility at the cost of transparency, allowing museums to fix their errors without admitting them or apologizing to visitors they'd misinformed. The decay of false belief happened through incremental adjustment rather than through dramatic confession. The popular culture persistence shows the zombie nature of debunked myths that continue circulating in entertainment and casual discourse despite scholarly rejection. Horror films and video games still feature Iron Maidens because creators and audiences don't track academic historical consensus. Wikipedia articles and online resources vary wildly in accuracy, with some correctly identifying Iron Maidens as forgeries while others perpetuate the myth. Casual conversations and popular history books often still reference Iron Maidens as medieval devices because people repeat what they learned decades ago without updating their knowledge. The myth has official half-life measured in decades or centuries as it gradually fades from public consciousness long after scholarly consensus rejected it. The implications for contemporary misinformation are sobering. If a relatively simple, factual question about object authenticity took over a century to resolve despite conclusive evidence, how long will it take to correct complex modern misinformation about politics, science, or history? If institutional incentives favor maintaining profitable myths over communicating accurate information, how can truth compete effectively? If popular culture keeps zombie myths alive indefinitely, regardless of scholarly consensus, does scholarly truth-telling even matter for public knowledge? The Iron Maiden's truth decay process suggests that once false beliefs become embedded in culture, correcting them requires generations and may never be fully accomplished. The myths become permanent features of cultural landscape regardless of their falsity. The Iron Maiden myth persisted partly through institutional memory problems where museums and universities lost track of how and why they acquired objects or adopted beliefs. The original curators who knew an Iron Maiden was questionable acquisition retired or died without documenting their doubts. Their successors inherited the object with established attribution and no paper trail explaining the original skepticism. Over time, the mere fact of the object being in the collection became evidence of authenticity, creating circular reasoning where presence proved legitimacy, because legitimate institutions only house authentic objects. The institutional amnesia about the object's origins allowed fraud to become accepted fact through bureaucratic succession. The documentation failures meant that even when serious scholars later questioned Iron Maiden authenticity, museums often couldn't provide acquisition records, provenance documentation, or authenticity reports that would settle the question. The absence of documentation should have raised suspicions, but instead often got interpreted as merely unfortunate gaps in record-keeping, rather than as red flags suggesting fraud. Museums filled documentation voids with plausible narratives about medieval origin, without evidence supporting those narratives beyond the object's physical existence. The institutional memory failure created space for myths to persist because challenges to authenticity couldn't be definitively proven when the very records that would prove or disprove authenticity didn't exist or were lost. The succession dynamics in academic and museum hierarchies creates incentives to defend predecessors' judgments rather than to question them. Admitting that previous curators or scholars were wrong about major acquisitions reflects poorly on the institution and implicitly criticizes respected former colleagues. The institutional culture values continuity and respect for precedent, creating pressure to maintain established attributions rather than to challenge them, even when evidence suggests error. Junior scholars who question established consensus risk being labeled troublemakers or attention seekers, while senior scholars have reputational investments in maintaining positions they've held for decades. The hierarchy enforces conformity that protects errors from correction. The knowledge transfer breakdowns occur during turnovers, when critical information gets lost because outgoing personnel don't realize which details are important to document, or because incoming personnel don't know which questions to ask. The tacit knowledge that one curator had about an Iron Maiden's suspicious provenance might die with that curator if they don't write it down, and if their successor doesn't specifically inquire. Museums and universities are terrible at preserving institutional knowledge through transitions, leading to repeated cycles where hard-learned lessons get forgotten and mistakes get repeated. The Iron Maiden myth benefited from these knowledge transfer failures that prevented skepticism from accumulating across generations. The solutions require systematic documentation of acquisition histories, authentication processes, and scholarly debates about objects in collections. Museums need accessible databases recording not just object descriptions, but also uncertainties, controversies, and evolving interpretations. They need succession planning that explicitly transfers tacit knowledge from outgoing to incoming staff. They need cultures that reward questioning established attributions rather than punishing challenges to institutional orthodoxy. Most importantly, they need to accept that admitting past errors strengthens rather than weakens institutional credibility by demonstrating commitment to accuracy over ego. The Iron Maiden debunking eventually happened despite institutional memory problems, but it took far longer than necessary because institutions protected myths rather than truth. Watching for Iron Maiden parallels in contemporary context means identifying claims that seem plausible, confirm existing beliefs, lack solid evidence, but gain acceptance through institutional validation and repetitive assertion. Modern examples abound in claims about historical events, scientific findings, and social phenomena that circulate as facts despite questionable evidence. The myth identification skills developed through understanding the Iron Maiden case transfer to contemporary skepticism about too good to be true stories that fit too perfectly with ideological commitments or cultural narratives. The pattern recognition allows earlier detection of emerging myths before they become as embedded as the Iron Maiden was. The social media acceleration creates Iron Maiden-style myths at unprecedented speed, where false claims can achieve global circulation in hours rather than decades. A dramatic story shared widely becomes accepted fact through sheer repetition, regardless of whether verification occurred. The same psychological and social mechanisms that spread the Iron Maiden myth operate faster through digital networks that connect billions of people who can share information instantly. The speed means myths can become entrenched before fact-checkers mobilize, before scholars publish rebuttals, before critical thinking can slow the viral spread. The contemporary environment is more hospitable to myth-making than the 19th century was, not less. The institutional validation through blue check marks, media citations, and expert endorsements provides modern equivalents of museum authentication. If reputable news organizations report a claim without verifying it, if universities host speakers promoting questionable theories, if government agencies accept studies with flawed methodology, these institutional validations confer legitimacy that individual skepticism struggles to challenge. The Iron Maiden gained credibility through museum display. Modern myths gain credibility through appearing in trusted media, being cited by credentialed experts, or being shared by verified accounts. The validation mechanisms differ, but the legitimation function is identical. The resistance to correction shows the same patterns where economic, professional, and psychological investments create constituencies defending myths against evidence. Media outlets resist retracting false stories because retractions damage credibility. Academics resist abandoning theories they've built careers on because admission of error threatens status. Partisan activists resist acknowledging when their side spreads misinformation because truth matters less than political utility. The defensive reactions to fact-checking and debunking mirror the museum resistance to acknowledging Iron Maiden forgeries. Truth threatens interests, creating opposition from parties benefiting from fiction. The pathway forward requires learning from how the Iron Maiden myth eventually collapsed despite persistent resistance. Systematic evidence accumulation eventually overwhelms denial. Scientific methodology provides verification that subjective judgment can't match. New generations without investment in old eras apply rigorous standards their predecessors avoided. Institutional incentives gradually shift toward accuracy when maintaining falsehoods becomes more costly than admitting them. The process takes time, requires patience, and never completely succeeds because myths have zombie afterlives in popular culture. But truth has advantage that lies eventually lose when sustained scrutiny exposes them. The Iron Maiden myth died slowly, but it died. Modern myths will too, though the timeline is uncertain and the struggle is ongoing. Thank you for spending over 2 hours exploring how a fake torture device reveals truths about social control and institutional authority. If you found value in examining how myths shape behavior and how quiet laws operate through imagined consequences, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to Candle History and share your thoughts below. What modern facts do you suspect might be myths? How do you think institutions should handle their past errors? I genuinely read every comment and learn from the conversations. We began with a torture device that never existed but accomplished more than real punishments could. Now, hours later, you understand that the Iron Maiden's power came not from its reality, but from its myth. Not from actual suffering it inflicted, but from imagined suffering it threatened. The device functioned as pure deterrence divorced from enforcement, as theatrical display that shaped choices through architecture of fear rather than through consistent consequences. It exemplified quiet laws that govern through perception rather than application, through creating belief in enforcement that exceeds actual enforcement. The myth did the work, so reality didn't have to. The parallels to modern governance are uncomfortable and unavoidable. We live in societies governed partly through quiet laws, where threat exceeds actuality, where belief in consequences shapes behavior more than consequences themselves, where institutions maintain order through managing perception rather than through consistent enforcement. The tax system, traffic law, professional licensing, and countless other regulatory frameworks operate through creating compliance via perceived risk that exceeds actual risk. The efficiency is undeniable. The ethics are questionable. The Iron Maiden represents this logic at its extreme: pure threat, zero enforcement, total deterrence through belief alone. The manufactured tradition pattern reveals how easily fiction becomes accepted fact when fiction serves institutional purposes, confirms cultural biases, and generates economic value. The Iron Maiden succeeded as myth because 19th century audiences wanted medieval barbarism to be real, because museums needed spectacular exhibits, because Gothic culture valued elaborate horror. The truth mattered less than the story's utility. This dynamic persists in contemporary contexts, where institutions promote narratives serving their interests regardless of accuracy, where audiences prefer dramatic simplifications to complex realities, where economic incentives favor profitable falsehoods over boring truths. The mechanisms producing the Iron Maiden myth are the same mechanisms producing modern misinformation. The institutional failure to acknowledge and correct the Iron Maiden fraud for decades demonstrates how organizations protect myths when truth threatens credibility, when admission requires confession, when accuracy costs more than deception. Museums continued displaying fraudulent devices because removing them meant admitting error, meant disappointing visitors, meant reduced revenue. The institutional self-preservation trumped educational mission. This pattern appears across contemporary institutions, where corporations hide product failures, governments conceal policy mistakes, universities protect fraudulent research, all because institutional interest in maintaining reputation exceeds commitment to accuracy. The Iron Maiden case study provides template for understanding these broader failures. The choice architecture insight about controlling behavior through perceived rather than actual consequences has profound implications for how we understand freedom and autonomy. If authorities can shape our choices through manipulating our beliefs about consequences without actually implementing those consequences, are we free in any meaningful sense? We make choices based on beliefs that may be false, avoiding behaviors we think are dangerous when they're not, pursuing outcomes we think are achievable when they're not. The architecture shapes us through our own cognition rather than through external force. The Iron Maiden logic suggests that the most effective control operates through making subjects police themselves based on internalized fears rather than through external enforcement. The truth decay process, showing how myths persist despite debunking for generations, is perhaps the most troubling lesson. If clear historical questions about object authenticity take century-long struggles to resolve against institutional resistance and popular culture persistence, how can we hope to correct complex contemporary misinformation about science, politics, or social issues? The Iron Maiden remained culturally potent long after scholarly consensus rejected it, because institutions maintained the myth, because popular culture kept circulating it, because corrections couldn't compete with the myth's emotional and narrative power. This suggests that modern misinformation may be a permanent feature of information landscape that fact-checking can slow but never eliminate. The educational malpractice of museums displaying known forgeries as authentic artifacts raises questions about every institution claiming educational authority. If museums can't be trusted to provide accurate information about their collections, what institutions can be trusted about anything? The breakdown of institutional credibility across domains creates crisis where expertise itself becomes suspect, where challenging authority is default rather than exception, where nothing can be accepted without independent verification. The erosion is both necessary response to institutional failure and dangerous undermining of functional expertise. The Iron Maiden case exemplifies how institutions earn distrust through prioritizing spectacle over accuracy. The comparative mythology show Iron Maiden as one instance of broader pattern where 19th century inventions get attributed to medieval periods reveals systematic bias in how modernity understands the past. We want medieval people to be more barbaric, more superstitious, more different than they were, because that difference confirms our progress narrative, makes us feel sophisticated by comparison, justifies our present as improvement over past. The Iron Maiden served that psychological need perfectly. Understanding this bias helps us recognize when we're accepting historical claims because they confirm what we want to believe rather than because evidence supports them. The critical distance becomes available once we see the pattern. The horror aesthetic appeal, explaining why Iron Maiden imagery persists despite historical debunking, demonstrates how different values compete in cultural production. Historical accuracy, emotional impact, narrative power, and commercial viability all create competing pressures on representations of the past. Horror entertainment values the Iron Maiden for affective power regardless of authenticity. Historical scholarship values accuracy regardless of dramatic appeal. The public gets caught between experts insisting on truth and entertainers delivering engaging fiction. Neither side is purely right or wrong. We need both accuracy and engagement, both truth and story. The challenge is maintaining boundaries between them so that entertainment doesn't masquerade as education, or education becomes so boring it reaches no one. Neither side is purely right or wrong.
We need both accuracy and engagement, both truth and story. The challenge is maintaining boundaries between them so that entertainment doesn't masquerade as education, or education becomes so boring it reaches no one.
What strikes me most forcefully is how the Iron Maiden myth exposes the power of belief to create functional realities regardless of underlying truth. If people believe consequences are certain when they're probabilistic, behavior changes as if certainty were real. If people believe punishments are severe when they're actually mild, compliance increases as if severity were real. If people believe authorities are competent when they're actually incompetent, order persists as if competence were real. The gap between perception and reality is governance space, where authorities operate through managing belief rather than changing facts. The Iron Maiden occupied that space perfectly. Real threat from imaginary device, actual behavioral modification from fictional enforcement. The final lesson might be about the relationship between skepticism and function. Questioning the Iron Maiden's authenticity was epistemologically correct but socially disruptive, because the myth served purposes that truth couldn't. Museums needed spectacular exhibits. Cultures needed medieval barbarism narratives. Horror needed iconic imagery. The myth was false but functional. Truth was accurate but less useful. This creates permanent tension between getting history right and using history well, between accuracy and utility, between truth and meaning. The Iron Maiden worked beautifully as myth while failing completely as history. Whether that trade-off was acceptable depends on whether you prioritize knowledge or function, truth or consequences. We began asking what a torture device that never existed tells us about social control. We end understanding it tells us everything about how control actually works. The most effective governance operates through quiet laws, enforced inconsistently, but believed thoroughly. The most powerful punishments are ones that don't occur, but shape behavior through threat alone. The most successful institutions manage perception rather than reality, because perception drives behavior more than reality does. The Iron Maiden that never tortured anyone was more effective than devices that actually punished thousands, because it lived in imagination, where fear compounds, rather than in reality, where pain ends. The lesson is that what people believe is happening matters more than what's actually happening. And authorities who master belief management need less actual enforcement than those who rely on real consequences. The Iron Maiden was perfect, quiet law. All fear, no pain, maximum compliance. The device worked best by not existing at all.